Because of our fear, we come up with these layers and layers of really savvy rationalization for why we shouldn't go into that cave we least want to enter. All right, you philosophical nerds. We are back, and we're back with a little bit of a series. And if this war drum soundtrack doesn't set the tone, I don't know what will. Because I just decided we're going to do a 18-part series with one lesson from each chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, the world's most famous poem, one that we didn't get translated in English until about 200 years ago. But as soon as we did, took these titans of thought by storm, from Emerson, Thoreau, Schopenhauer, Carl Jung, Aldous Huxley. You got Joseph Campbell, some T.S. Eliot. You've got some absolute badasses throughout history, the West, specifically literary badasses, that took to this thing like flies to S. They loved, that's a phrase we use in Texas. And although we don't say S, that's the California version of the phrase. And the reason that I take to this, that I absolutely love the intricacies, the symbolism. I mean, I don't even have words for the depth that this poem has. It's a 30-minute read. I've done a series on the Gita before, a 20-part series on the 10 most renowned lessons, most popular, kind of often discussed lessons from the Gita, and then 10 under-discussed lessons from the Gita that you can go check out earlier in the Daily Vedantic podcast project. But I've never gone through it chapter by chapter. This is out of the 3-year course at the ashram in India. There are 2 years reserved just for the Gita. 2 years for a 30-minute conversation. 700-verse poem between Arjuna, this warrior prince, and who he thinks is just his charioteer, who ends up being a symbolic embodiment of God as his charioteer, and the dialogue between this famous warrior prince that is now presented with this massive battle, the peak of a civil war that's been raging for 13 years. The battle that both sides have wanted for 13 years. It's finally here, and the warrior prince asks Krishna, his charioteer, to take him to the middle of the battlefield so that he can survey both sides. He kind of is making that up. He really just wants to get away from both sides. And not without complete loss of honor, he's like, take me to the middle of the battlefield. He's trying to get some space. But as he gets closer and closer to the middle of the battlefield, he realizes just how big the army on the opposing side actually is. And even though he is on the side of righteousness, fighting for righteousness, he sees just how undermatched he is, and has a complete meltdown in the middle of the battlefield. Chapter 1, which is today's reflection, is often talked about as a throwaway chapter because Arjuna, the warrior prince that is buckling at the knees and melting down, who is kind of a fool in many ways, and that's somewhat disrespectful to many people that revere Arjuna, but though he is this noble, brave warrior prince, without a guide, he is a total fool in this circumstance. The guide is what shakes him out of his foolishness. And chapter 1 is typically seen as a throwaway chapter because it's Arjuna speaking, asking to be taken to the middle of the battlefield. There's also about 20 lines of just history of of history of lines, a lineage history. There is kind of just setting the scene before chapter 2. And about 11 verses in, that's when Krishna starts to speak. And that's when S gets real. But I love the first chapter. And I will tell you why. And this is the takeaway from the first chapter. In the midst of Arjuna folding like a lawn chair, out of fear of what could happen in this battle that looks like they are massively undermatched. In his fear, he doesn't come up with a dishonorable way to get out of it. He doesn't come up with a unsavvy way to get out of the battle. This chapter is often called the spiritual bypass because this is where Arjuna makes a really savvy case for fleeing from the battle because it's not right to conduct any sort of violence or harm towards their kith and kin. This is a civil war. These are their cousins that they are fighting that, well, unrighteously are ruling the kingdom. And it is him and his brothers who are the rightful heirs to the throne. So many times in life, when we take the cowardly route, we certainly don't say we're taking the cowardly route. We often don't even think we're taking the cowardly route because we've justified our actions with 7, 8, 9 layers of savvy justification of why we're taking the coward's way out. Why we're not going towards the battle at hand, why we're not pushing against whatever forces of unrighteousness might be before you. Really, not pushing against whatever force that might be in front of you that you are afraid of. Because of our fear, we come up with these layers and layers of really savvy rationalization for why we shouldn't go into that cave we least want to enter. As Joseph Campbell, who I mentioned before, he was actually the secretary of, I believe he was the secretary of the Vedanta Society of New York for 3 years, a known Vedantin, as he famously said, the treasure you seek is in the cave you least want to enter. And on some level, we might know that what we're really seeking is right on the other side of what we might fear most. And yet it's 1 in 1,000 that actually go through that fear. 999 of us come up with either really lame or really savvy arguments, justifications, rationalizations to get out of that obligation. And that's what Arjuna does in chapter 1 as he babbles on and on of, we shouldn't be doing this. This is our family. We should be fleeing from this and going to study philosophy in the forest. In not so many words, that is what chapter 1, that is what Arjuna is saying in chapter 1 as he is completely broken down by the prospect of death, of defeat. He's so focused on what might happen, so focused on what might happen to him that he's doing anything to get out of that situation, that risk, and that mental torment. But this is the really interesting thing when it comes to a fork in the road for any of us. Maybe it's a fork in the road between 2 jobs, fork in the road between adventure and safety. Maybe it's a fork in the road between quite literally sticking up for righteousness in the face of unrighteousness where death might be on the other side. But this is a relevant chapter for any of us, where you are in a fork in the road where you're choosing between 2 jobs, choosing between adventure or safety, choosing between safe, comfortable route, keeping your mouth shut, not rocking the boat, not shaking things up, turning a blind eye to unrighteousness, and the alternative, speaking up, putting yourself potentially in harm's way, doing what you ought to do. And in that fork in the road, so often we think, well, what do I get in either of these scenarios? Maybe it's one job versus another. You're thinking, what do I get between these two choices? These two life paths. And that is the wrong question. It is not a calculation of what do I get on the other side of this decision. It is, what do I become? That's important. That's the question. What do I become? Because we take all of our decisions with us. We are our commitments. And whatever choice you do make, whenever you've got a fork in the road, the question shouldn't be, what do I get? What do I risk? What might I lose? But it should be, who do I become with this decision versus the other? And which version of you does your community need? Does your family need? Or put most simply, which version of you do you want to become? The one that takes the spiritual bypass? Or the one that does what they ought to do? This series is going to go, like I said, through all 18 chapters. But the biggest takeaway from chapter 1 isn't about cowardice. It isn't even about doing what we ought to do. Those are secondary aspects of chapter 1. I think the most important takeaway from chapter 1 is realizing just how friggin' savvy the mind is, coming up with reasons why you shouldn't do what you ought to do, why you should shirk from duty and obligation, go for comfort, ease, sprinkle on some philosophy in there, and go away from action and what's right. The spiritual bypass. It is such a good reminder every time I think about this theme within this chapter. Because Arjuna doesn't make some lame argument. He does not say, we shouldn't do this, I'm scared. He says it confidently. We shouldn't be doing this. We should peace out of here, go study philosophy. We should practice not harming anyone around us. This is wrong, Krishna and his charioteer, who's actually neutral in the fight. He had said years prior, don't do this. You all shouldn't be doing this. But once the battle was set, once it was on, once the horns were blowing, Krishna looked at Arjuna and he's like, what the hell are you talking about? You have to fight this battle. And he gives one epic delivery on why in the coming chapters. So tomorrow we'll see you for chapter 2 of the Gita, when Krishna starts cooking, when the symbolic embodiment of God starts to drop knowledge bomb after knowledge bomb after knowledge bomb on the way things is, on who Krishna is, on who Arjuna is, on what this field, the field that they are on, the battlefield, the field that we are on, what this is. It is exceedingly rare to find a spiritual text, a philosophical text that has the whole philosophy within it. You can find, say, Gospels in the New Testament that need other texts around it, because each one is not meant to be self-contained and the only thing that you need. But with the Gita, it is constructed in a way to where every aspect, every question, every answer, every articulation, exposition on the world, on who we are, on what this is all about, is contained within those 700 verses. It's contained within these 18 chapters. And it's going to be fun to dive into each one with you, with chapter 2 coming up tomorrow. This has been another reflection on the Daily Vedantic.